When you think about a steam locomotive, you probably picture it on land gliding along the steel rails. But today's video is more about the submarine type. I know. It sounds crazy, but this is a 100% true story. In fact, we will be talking about multiple instances of Canadian Pacific steam locomotives that are at just about the same depth of Lake Superior as the Edmund Fitzgerald. To kick this one off, we gotta go back to 1906. Canadian Pacific 694 was a D-10B 460 steam locomotive built in 1906 by the Montreal Locomotive Works. The engine was one of 502 examples of this model engine. This engine was put in freight service and served the CP until 1910. Now let's talk about why. One early morning in 1910, the engine was pulling a train along the northern shore of Lake Superior at a place called Mink Harbor. A rock slide had occurred hours prior, unbeknownst to the train crew, and this unfortunately would prove to be fatal. The train slammed into the rock side, sending 694 and two boxcars off the side of the cliff into the deep waters of Lake Superior, with the locomotive coming to a rest at 235 feet below the surface. Unfortunately, 3 men would lose their lives in this wreck. 106 years after the wreck occurred, a dive crew located the locomotive, which is surprisingly in decent condition after flying off a cliff and sitting all this time at the bottom of Lake Superior. If you thought this was the only time the Canadian Pacific would assign a locomotive to submarine operations, you'd be very wrong. Canadian Pacific 3512 was a N-2 280 consolidation steam locomotive built by the Montreal Locomotive Works, sometime between 1912 and 1914. Much about the engine's lifetime is unknown, but the end of it is known. On January 1st, 1947, 3512 was loaded onto a barge along with several pieces of rolling stock and a snowplow for a trip across Sunken Lake. As the barge traveled across the lake, being pulled by a tug, it developed a heavy list. The captain of the barge ordered the train crew to move the engine to combat the list, but the engine had cooled down, therefore making this impossible. The crew had no choice but to cut the line from the tugboat and the barge. This sent the locomotive and the rolling stock plunging into the lake. Thankfully, no one was hurt or killed in this incident. The locomotive was found nearly 75 years after the sinking, lying 730 feet down, upside down, with the tender remaining upright, along with several pieces of rolling stock. The engine was heavily damaged from the sinking, but was preserved really well, even after all this time. The Canadian Pacific supposedly sank a few more locomotives, but I haven't found that to be factual from my research. Well, now you can say you've seen a few submarine steam engines. Also, fun fact, there's more locomotives underwater than there are ships on railroad tracks.